Joining us now is Murtaza Hussain of Dropside News, great friend of the show. It's good to see you, man. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's break down some of the military interceptor problem that we're already beginning to see in Israel. First, we're going to start with C1. We have a video here from NBC News, been verified, but we're all going to watch. I mean, this is the problem in a nutshell. You are watching two Israeli interceptors try to shoot down this incoming Iranian missile. They both miss, and you watch as it strikes deep in the heart of Tel Aviv, in the middle of a city. This comes on the heel, Maz, of this new report from my friend Shelby Talcott over at Semaphore. Israel is running critically low on interceptors, reportedly entered the current war already low, and have now informed the United States that they need to be topped up. Obviously, we have ourselves a very finite supply. So what do you make of the ongoing munitions and interceptor problem after only 2 weeks of war?
Well, the crazy thing is that before the war started, this was seen as maybe the preeminent reason not to have the war.
No.
Like there were many other reasons we're seeing now with the Strait of Hormuz and so forth, very dire reasons. But arguably, the number one reason was the lack of interceptors. These interceptors are extremely expensive. They're very time consuming to produce. I believe in the previous years, the U.S. sometimes only produced a dozen a year or something like that. They're very, very finite, both for the U.S. and U.S. allies. And as you showed in that video, oftentimes you have to fire several interceptors to try to defeat a single Iranian missile, and maybe it won't even be successful. So the math kind of favors the Iranians here. Really, the U.S.'s really goal would have to be to suppress Iranian fire before the interceptors run out. There's no indication that Iranian missiles will run out right now. They're firing at a slower pace, but they've also said that they're planning for a war which could go on for months or even years potentially. So it could be the tempo of their operations. We don't really know. A lot of the stuff is classified, but we do know now that the interceptor fears that were raising before the war are now being leaked out. And if we're in a situation where the Iranians are still firing and the interceptors are out, that's very disastrous for the Israeli side in this case. And I'll add one last thing. These interceptors are intended to defend the whole world. So they're intended to defend the U.S. positions in Asia. They're needed in Ukraine as well, too. So if you're draining down the global supply in one theater, there's going to be tremendous knock-on effects. And you could actually incentivize escalation in Asia because you're making it easy for the Chinese and North Koreans because they don't have the same defense munitions to face that they are, which are being used now in Iran.
Yeah. And what about, I feel like we're being gaslit about the amount of Iranian capacity that has been taken out by the Israelis and the Americans. The sort of race is between the US and Israel trying to destroy not just the missiles, but the missile launchers and, their stockpiles of interceptors running out as Iran continues to be able to fire missiles and then also use drones to menace the region. So what do we know about how much the Iranian capacity to fire missiles has been degraded and what their stockpile of these Shahed drones is as well?
Well, almost from the beginning of the war, the U.S. and Israel said that they've eliminated Iran's ability more or less to fire missiles, using figures like 60%, 70%, 90% in terms of destruction of launchers and so forth. There's been some contravening evidence about that. It's hard to say exactly. What we can say for sure is that the Iranians are still firing more than 2 weeks into the war, which is something I don't think people expected. Secondly, pre-war, they had very significant capacity for manufacturing missiles, but also these Shahed drones you mentioned. The drones, some estimates say they can cost less than $10,000 each. Iran entered serial production of the drones many years ago, so they were mass producing them for a very long period. And it's a sort of a variable that surprisingly the US and Israel didn't account for before, which is that these cheap drones give Iran precision strike capacity far beyond at a greater scale than people would have understood before. I think it would be very hard to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, before without these drones. You need to have actual ships go out there, you need to mine it. You need maybe artillery launchers at the shore and so forth. But now that these drones are very accurate, you can fly them into ships. And some estimates say they might have tens of thousands. They could be fighting them for many, many years even. And they're still producing them now, even perhaps in facilities embedded in the mountains and underground, the Al-Borz Mountains. So I think that the whole mythos that Iran had no production capacity, had no ability to resist, was sort of given to Trump, probably by the Israelis more, to make it seem like it's a cakewalk to get him in a situation which he is now mired.
One of the things, Miles, that we've been looking at in particular are some of these new cluster munitions. Let's put C4 up there on the screen just to give everybody an example. This is from CNN, but there are multiple other reports out here. How the use of cluster munitions is actually challenging Israeli air defense. There is actually, say, an unnerving spectacle that has become a feature of the war in Israel, outfitting some of the ballistic missiles with cluster munitions that pierce through Israel's sophisticated air defense systems. They carry up to 11 pounds of explosives. They cluster and explode over, so that way they can't be intercepted, and then they can hit over a multiple-mile radius. So the fact that they are still able to launch ballistic missiles and even drones, I think does fundamentally challenge the U.S. narrative. The U.S. narrative is, what is it, 95% of production, and then they'll say that launches are down. What I've noticed, though, is that our strikes are also down. So in terms of the number of initial strikes that happened in the first couple of days of the war, our strikes seem to be also significantly down, so-called precision strikes, not counting the Israelis, of course, who are just bombing, whatever they desire. But what we continue to see is that after a couple of weeks, they're still able to launch missiles. They're still able to hit not launch drones. They're able to launch and hit critical infrastructure. And even if we do hit all the production facilities that we know about, there could be many others that we don't know about. So this seems to spell a country able to resist for the medium to long term. Or do you see it differently?
No, I totally agree with you. And one thing is very important in the war. As much devastation has happened in Iran so far, it's mostly been in the western and central parts of the country. There's a huge eastern part of the country, which is kind of out of the range of these airstrikes and has not really been affected. It wasn't affected in the last war either, just because it's much more difficult to strike. So, they've been preparing for this conflict for literally generations. They've dispersed the production facilities around the country, underground and so forth. So it's very, very difficult to completely destroy it, although they are doing tremendous damage to Iran's industrial base. I think that, if you look at the Iranian statements and take them for what they will, but they claim that they haven't even fired the missiles they produced in the last decade. They say they're firing the older missiles and they're saving the more advanced ones for later in the conflict when they expect that the Israeli defenses will be down further. These attacks that have been taking place on the missile defenses in Israel, for instance, they're all basically down payments on future attacks. Because if you can use your less advanced missiles up front, you drain down the defense batteries on those, and then you can use the more advanced ones later on for much more devastating attacks. And that's, it seems, what they're doing here specifically. And, to your other point, the way that these air campaigns operate is that they're more intense at the beginning. You have all your assets in there. The shock and awe happens up front. And the U.S. strategy was that in the shock and awe should collapse the Iranian government. They shouldn't be in the position to continue firing. Because, as you said, the pace and intensity of U.S. operations decreases over time for logistical reasons. And even Israeli operations will decrease over time. So I think that now that we have a situation where U.S. ability to course by the air is actually decreasing because the sortie rate is decreasing, logistics are becoming a factor. Meanwhile, the Iranian fire rate is staying relatively stable now. And that's not an advantageous position. The Iranians designed this war to be a marathon, whereas the Israeli-U.S. preference is a sprint. And now it seems like we're entering the marathon.
Yeah.
Very interesting. What do we know about the actual damage inside of Israel and the GCC member states? These are all authoritarian countries. We've been talking here about the level of censorship, the threats against anyone posting any of the images of destruction. You also have these private satellite companies that have decided to do the bidding of the U.S. and Israel and take down their satellite images so that they are no longer accessible. So we can't see the extent of the damage here.
Well, it was very notable. Up to about March 7th, we were seeing satellite images of very serious destruction at U.S. military bases in the region, advanced radars, including for the THAAD radar system, one of which is being moved from South Korea now to replenish it in the Middle East. So the Iranians had pretty accurate precision strike capacities against U.S. military assets throughout the Gulf and also targets in the Gulf. And we've seen now reports of people being arrested in very large numbers in the UAE and elsewhere for taking photos of the aftermath of these strikes. Israel has similar censorship in place. I'm not sure the level of extent of total damage per se at the moment, because I don't think the Iranians are actually trying to inflict physical damage or even kill people specifically. That can be a byproduct of the operations. But the one thing they're aiming to do is to increase economic pain globally. And say that if you're taking us down, we're going to take everyone down with you, specifically in the Gulf states, and also to unnerve the Israelis and keep them in a position of long-term war that can also manifest in greater destruction down the road if the interceptors run out. So right now, the Iranian position is not actually to create mass havoc. They're trying more to kind of keep the temperature at a level that they can maintain and that they prefer. So I think the question now is, what will the response be? And like I said, and Saagar, you said as well too, the strike rates are going down. So can the U.S. escalate? Will the U.S. have to invade parts of Iran or launch a ground operation? It's actually headed in that direction. Either there's a capitulation or escalation, and neither is a very enviable prospect. And I will say one thing. This morning, I was actually looking at Iranian news. There was a airstrike against a very strange target. It was a civilian headquarters for an electricity company. And several engineers and employees were killed at the company. I don't think they were expecting to be struck. It wasn't a military target. So I think what the Israeli-U.S. strategy now, and this is probably Israeli strike to be honest, is more to, if you can't coerce them militarily, see if you can inflict so much civilian pain to the infrastructure and so forth that they just capitulate for that reason.
Yeah.
But I think that also will not be the case. I don't think they capitulate now after everything has happened at this point.
Oh, of course. I mean, even trying to do that with ground troops is itself a nightmare. Yeah, let's kill all the electricians. It'll surely work out, just like it did in Iraq, right? Take out the civil servants, make sure that you collapse the country into civil war, and of course, nothing will blow back on all of us. I want to get your reaction. Can we put C5 up here on the screen? The Iranians are warning, the Iranian Secretary of the Supreme National Council is warning that remaining members of Epstein's network have devised a conspiracy for false flag attacks similar to 9/11 that will be blamed on Iran. Let's put all of his, propaganda and rhetoric and all that aside, even though some of it might even be true. What should we make then of this warning? Obviously, the Trump allies are going to say, well, that means he's planning something. And then, of course, others, many of us who are very skeptical about any potential major terrorist attack here on U.S. soil or some sort of precipitating event, which would, a Gulf of Tonkin, let's say something like that, for example, which would require, some sort of escalation. It is clear, are they trying to, what do you make of their statement then, of why they're putting it out?
Well, I think there's a number of things. First of all, the invocation of Epstein is quite common in Iranian communications about the war, partly because they want to highlight the corruption of the ruling class of the U.S., that this Epstein situation going on literally right before the war. So that's something that's become a common part of their public communications. Secondly, I do think they're trying to emphasize that they don't have a conflict with the American public. It's kind of a very consistent messaging in Iranian politics. Even during Ali Khamenei, you had these notorious denunciations of the U.S., but he would often differentiate that from the American people and say it's a conflict with the American ruling class. So this is kind of consistent with that. And finally, I do think that there is a possibility that the U.S. government or the Israeli government especially could engineer a circumstance that creates a casus belli for escalation or tries to create a greater public support for escalation. Because right now this war is very unpopular with the U.S. It's actually the most unpopular war perhaps started by polls at its outset we've ever seen, at least in our lifetimes, certainly. And as time goes on, wars don't become more popular. They become less popular, especially when casualties start mounting. And we're going to see very soon when inflation starts going crazy in the United States because of oil prices and food prices and then many, many things that are going to be affected by the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. People are going to be very upset. What can get them back on board is some sort of incident that causes, alarm or fear and results in people's rallying to the war itself. That could be an attack, like what was alluded to in that statement. But I also think that this push to seize Kharg Island in Iran by Lindsey Graham and others, that is something which is almost certainly going to generate U.S. casualties. It could generate catastrophic U.S. casualties if you look at the actual geography of the island and what could that mission could entail. So I think this is actually a trap to try to get more Americans killed in some way in order to make the war popular, which is not popular when it started.
Yeah.
Wow.
You're right.
Can we put C6 up on the screen? As you know, I'm sure, Maz, there are all kinds of rumors online that Netanyahu has been killed by the Iranians. He waited a few days and then he put out this video of him in a coffee shop. Now the sleuths are saying this one may be AI too. In an attempt to turn this into an intelligent question, I was taking a look at some of the new polling that has come out about Americans' views of Israel. And I mean, compared to where the country has been historically, the negativity that Americans feel towards this country is truly shocking. And I think is evidenced by the amount of excitement over the idea that Netanyahu may have been killed here. You've got overall only 32% of Americans, according to this NBC News poll, who have a positive view of Israel. 39% have a negative view. If you look at the independent and the Democratic numbers in particular, I mean, it is stunning. Only 13% of Democrats have a positive view of Israel. I think most of them are in DC or like Josh Shapiro planning on running for president. So how much of Israel's calculation is the fact that they know the political landscape in the US is changing incredibly rapidly. They know that this current president, who they can, apparently get whatever they want from, and who, they funded his campaign overwhelmingly, that his party is very unpopular. He's very unpopular. Democrats are very likely to retake the White House. And then they have a very different situation potentially on their hands with regard to support from the American superpower. So how much of that logic plays into, their sense like it's now or never? We got to do this thing. We got to do it all the way, come what may.
Well, it's funny too. When you look at those stats, they're very stark, as you pointed out. I think they're even more stark when you segment them out for age too, because even on the Republican side, it's more the Mark Levin generation, which is a very gung ho about Israel. Even younger conservatives are much more divided, at least about the subject. So I do think that, in a sense, in public support, the clock is ticking. But despite that, it's kind of insidious. I think that they're still planning to hold on to American support, even if there's very low popular support for Israel. Because if you look at the moves that the Israeli government's making with this administration, they're trying to embed many more years of cooperation and U.S. support, security-wise, and others. For a very, very long time for Israel, making these memorandums of understanding for maybe 10, 15 years to continue not funding Israel, quote unquote, but basically, doing defense cooperation, which winds up being the same thing. And likewise, they're maintaining ties with the American elites. So they would like to have a situation where they have a very good relationship with the American elites. They can sort of change the legal landscape, even in the United States, to insulate themselves from criticism as much as possible from the public. Sort of exploit the corruption of the American political system to keep getting what they want. And I think that they actually aren't committed to giving this up. Maybe they'll have to tone it down a little bit or be a little bit more behind the scenes. But I think they would like to maintain a relationship with American elites that survives American public hostility. And that we have precedents for that. The U.S. cooperates very closely with Saudi Arabia for a very long time. Saudi Arabia is not very popular in the United States, but they still get quite a bit out of American elites. And I think the Israelis like to move towards that. But to your point, Krystal, I do think that Netanyahu right now is trying to do a bank run on the United States, get as much out of it as he can at the moment, because he mentioned he does have a very pliant U.S. president, but also he's thinking of his own end of his life and his legacy. He wants to be known as the guy who destroyed Iran, who destroyed Gaza, did all these different things, and he knows that he has a great opportunity to do that right now. So I think that it's a confluence of the trends you pointed out, but also Netanyahu's own political calculations.
Yeah, literally while you and I are talking, just came across hundreds of the thousands of Lebanese civilians being told they will not return to their homes. Israel completely invading southern Lebanon. In a different world, that's a huge headline. Isn't this the first invasion since 2006, which at the time was a huge war? Everybody covered it. Now, effectively being told you can never come back until, quote, the safety of Israelis living near the border has ensured. Who wants to guess that it'll never be ensured, the safety of Israelis, and that we just saw another expansion of the Israeli state with its borders?
Absolutely. There's many precedents for this in the past. And according to the Israeli state ideology, the more hardcore versions of it, southern Lebanon is part of Israel. So they have a territorially irredentist view towards this, regardless of any security concern. They want it for other reasons. So I think this is just one of like 7 wars the Israelis are fighting at the moment. And it's very uncommon in history for a country to be like that. And the level of death that's happened in Lebanon, basically not reported so much because of all the other wars. Maybe 800 people have been killed in just 4 or 5 days, rapidly expanding every single day. The displacement you mentioned. This is really a situation I don't think we've seen since like Imperial Japan, a country which is so brutal and so multi-directionally violent that it's almost become part of the national character. And there's also a lot of violence happening in the West Bank as well, too, at the moment. Very escalated violence, ethnic cleansing. So, that's not very popular, most people in the world. And people just recoil against that. Even countries in Europe, which officially support Israel very strongly, like Germany, if you look at public opinion, it's soured quite a bit. and very rapidly. So, one wonders if a country can survive a situation where its unpopularity is growing so much more. I do think that they're planning for that, but there's no end game really. It seems like they would have wars that are going to be going on for many, many years. And I do think at some point there are questions of how that can be sustained absent, ongoing high levels of political support abroad.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for. Oh, go ahead, Krystal.
One last for you. Let's put C7 up on the screen. I mean, this footage is just unbelievable of a drone that has pierced a U.S. base, and you can see it, just flying around at will, going wherever it wants to go. And ultimately, we can continue keeping this up on the screen. Ultimately, it hones in on a target and goes in here and causes some level of damage. And we know that U.S. bases around the region have been damaged. I mean, there is a good chance that this effectively ends the U.S. as the global superpower, as the invincible hegemon of the world. How does Israel view that possibility? Is that a problem for them because U.S. is such a benefactor for them? Is that a plus for them because we are one of their rivals for influence throughout the region? How do you think that they view that possibility?
I'll say two things, and I want to comment very quickly on that video too. I was very frightened when I saw that video because that video reminded me of many, many videos I've seen like this from the Ukraine-Russia war. That's a fiber optic drone. So it's a drone that's very difficult to jam and so forth. And, we've seen so many videos of Russian soldiers running for their lives and being killed by these drones in the last moments of their life. And now these drones are disseminating around the world. And the U.S. is in this war now in Iraq and Iran, all these places because of the attack on Iran. That's, I don't want to see images of American soldiers running from these drones. It's horrifying. Those videos are very, very devastating. So I think that expanded, that what I showed in that video is a very, very chilling sort of escalation of the conflict in terms of the way the technology is diffusing. But secondly, to your point, Krystal, what's happening right now is completely anathema to conventional views of maintaining American interests abroad. There's a theory in foreign relations that the ideal view for America abroad is to engage in a strategy of offshore balancing. And offshore balancing means that, you don't let any other country become the hegemon in its region. You keep a balance between them because if they're a hegemon, then they could start undermining our interests. What we're doing in Israel is something totally different from that. We're creating an Israeli hegemon. We are destroying all their enemies over years. And if you look at the last several decades, pretty much all of them have either been heavily suppressed or totally destroyed. And Iran is really the last one. So if you destroy Iran, you've created an Israeli superpower, basically. Israel is the military superpower of the region. It's a tremendous shift in what was maybe when it started, it was a very small, kind of nascent country with U.S. support to become a superpower. So you created a potential competitor to America in the future. Someone could stop American interests. A country which is not very popular with Americans as well, too. That you're creating a potential enemy, someone who's also embedded in your own systems and surveillance in a very strong way. This is completely against American interests. Leave aside all the moral judgments and so forth about it. Creating another rival or potential rival superpower or regional power has never been an American policy before. The right thing to do is to balance Israel against its other neighbors and create sort of a stasis that the Americans can be at top of and be the interlocutor for and so forth. What's happening right now is very injurious. And if you have a situation maybe 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, where American views of Israel have soured a lot, but because all Israel's enemies have been destroyed by America, it's extremely powerful. They can do that to stop our own interests in the region and abroad. They can use it to threaten people in America. It's not an outlandish scenario. And Israel, despite everything, is not a treaty ally of the United States. And the reason they're not a treaty ally is if they're an ally, they'd have to support us if we had a problem. They didn't want to have that reciprocal relationship. It's a very one-way sponsorship relationship. So I think that, this destruction of Iran, potentially the degradation of Iran and everything that may happen going forward. This is something which is tremendously injurious to American interests. And, it's against the basic philosophy of American foreign policy as it's been constructed for centuries.
Yes, you're right.
Very interesting.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate you.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.